He had given up hope after years of watching from behind those cold metal bars as people passed his cage every day, their faces brightening as they picked out puppies, papers were signed, excited voices filled the air, and tails wagged as the dogs left with their new families. But one day, something changed, and a couple stood in front of his kennel, staring at him. At first, he assumed they were just like everyone else, curious but uninterested, but then they pointed at him, the worker nodded, papers were signed, and at that point, he realized he was going home, but what happened next was unexpected. Hunter had lost track of how long he had been in the shelter. Days had flown into weeks, weeks into months, and months into what seemed like an eternity. At first, he had been hopeful, jumping to his feet, wagging his tail, and pressing his nose against the metal bars of his cage whenever someone passed through the adoption area in the hopes that today would be the day, but it never came. He had seen too many dogs come and go, each departing with a new family, while he stayed behind with the active puppies. The small breeds, even some of the older dogs, were all picked before him. He had tried everything to attract attention, including sitting quietly and looking up with beseeching eyes in hopes of gaining sympathy, but that had also failed. At one point, he had just given up trying, and now when people passed by, he hardly raised his head. The shelter was a noisy, chaotic place where dogs barked non-stop, the concrete floors were always cold, and volunteers. Hunter never felt free when he went to feed them, clean their cages, and occasionally take them for short walks outside. His cage was small, barely large enough for him to turn around in, and his food bowl was always full, but the kibble was dry and tasteless. The only time he felt warm was when a staff member came by to scratch behind his ears, but those times were infrequent. At night, when the barking stopped and the lights went down, he allowed himself to remember that he had a warm bed and a real home once. He was just another abandoned shelter dog waiting for a chance that might never come. One afternoon, he was lying in his usual spot, resting his head on his paws, when he noticed movement outside his kennel. He had seen many visitors before, who would usually stop and look into each cage before moving on, but these two didn't. The shelter worker nodded as they continued to stare at him. A short while later, the latch on his cage clicked, a leash was placed around his neck, a voice called his name, and then, for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, he stepped outside. The air outside the kennel felt different for so long. The only world Hunter had known was the small area behind those metal bars, the smell of disinfectant and the sound of. The leash around his neck was loose, but the shelter worker held it gently as he walked toward the front of the building. His paws touched the tile floor, and he hesitated for a moment, wondering where he was going. He had previously been out of his cage, but only for brief walks in the small play area behind the shelter, and each time he had been taken back to his kennel, to the same small space that had become his. Barking dogs and the cold floor had become his reality. Hunter continued walking as the shelter worker led him through a hallway and then toward the glass doors at the entrance. Beyond the doors, he could see sunlight streaming onto the sidewalk as cars passed by. A warm breeze blew through the trees outside. It had been so long since he had truly been outside, and the couple was waiting for him. This time, Prison felt different. He could feel the other dogs' eyes watching him as he passed their kennels. Some barked, some whined, but most just stared silently, curious. They had seen other dogs leave before and knew what it meant. Hunter was standing close to the front desk, holding a stack of papers in his hands, when the woman smiled softly and knelt down a little as he approached. He was unsure, so the worker gave the leash a gentle tug. "It's okay, buddy," the man said in a calm, steady voice. Hunter, these two had stopped and were now taking him somewhere. Hunter was still unsure of what to do, so the worker handed him the leash. Hunter hesitated, then lowered his head. Hunter's nose twitched slightly as he inhaled her scent, which was different from the shelter worker's scents of lavender and something warm and familiar. The woman's smile widened, and she whispered, "You're coming home with us." That word stirred something deep in Hunter's chest, and he had nearly forgotten what it meant. The man completed signing the paperwork, and the shelter worker stepped back, and suddenly Hunter was no longer a shelter dog. As the couple led him toward the doors, the world outside seemed unnaturally large. The sunlight hit his fur, and he squinted a little at the brightness. The city sounds were louder than he remembered. Cars were talking, birds were chirping, and then he saw the car. The woman opened the back door and motioned for him to get in, but Hunter hesitated for a moment, his body tensed, and an old memory came back to him. The last time he had been in a car, it hadn't gone well. Hunter's hesitation must have shown on his face because the man knelt next to him, his hand stroking his back. "It's okay, buddy," he said again, softer this time, and Hunter looked up at him. There was something in the man's eyes, something patient, something kind. Hunter stepped slowly and carefully. Hunter lay down with his head resting on his paws as the car pulled away from the shelter. He had no idea what was waiting for him, but for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps this time would be different. The car ride was quiet, and Hunter lay in the back seat with his body still and his breathing slow. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic movement of the car. Hunter didn't allow himself to relax just yet because he didn't know where they were taking him. The woman Emily turned in her seat and looked back at him, saying softly, "He's so calm." Daniel replied, keeping his eyes on the road. He had previously been in a car once, but that memory wasn't a good one because it was the last time he had seen his old home and the last time he had felt a familiar touch. That day, the car ride ended in confusion, fear, and a place he never expected, the shelter. As the car slowed, the outside world changed, with tall buildings and noisy streets giving way to quieter roads, trees, and houses with wide yards. Eventually, they stopped, leaving only the soft chirping of birds outside. Hunter lifted his head, the door opened, and fresh air rushed in, warm and full of unfamiliar scents. Daniel reached into. "It's a lot of change all at once." Hunter flicked his ears listening, and he could sense the emotion in their voices, soft, patient, and careful. The back seat and carefully clipped the leash to Hunter's collar. "All right, big guy," he said, "let's go home." Hunter hesitated for a second before getting out of the car, and his paws touched soft grass. The ground beneath him was real, living earth, not cold concrete or the shelter's hard, unforgiving floors. He stood motionless, looking around him, and he saw a simple but welcoming house with a wooden bench on the porch, flowers near the walkway, and the scent of freshly cut grass. As Emily knelt a few feet away, holding the leash loosely in her hands, she said, "You're okay, take your time." Hunter glanced at her, then at Daniel, who was standing next to her. They weren't dragging him inside, they weren't pushing him, they were letting him make his own decisions, so he took a cautious step forward, then another, and as he entered the front door, he felt something strange stir deep inside his chest, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to have in a long, long time. When he cautiously took another step, Emily and Daniel stood nearby, watching him but not pressuring him to move. They were waiting. He wasn't used to that. In the shelter everything was on a schedule, the workers came in and fed the dogs, and the house smelled different from anything he had known in a long time. It wasn't the overpowering mix of dog food and metal cages or the sharp scent of disinfectant from the shelter, but rather warm wood, fresh laundry, and something faintly sweet, possibly food. His nails clicked softly against the hardwood floor. Hunter glanced at her and then at Daniel, who stood next to her with his hands in his pockets, relaxed but perceptive. They weren't forcing him to do anything, but the thought of lying down in that bed felt wrong. Dogs cleaned the cages and removed them when they had time, and no one waited for a dog to feel ready. The room's furnishings were soft and inviting, including a couch, rug, and dog bed in the corner. It had been a long time since he had a place of his own. Instead, he walked toward the couch and sniffed the fabric. Emily smiled and said, "You can go up," but Hunter didn't jump up because he knew better. He was sitting on the floor next to him when she gave him permission. Hunter flicked an ear, but he wasn't sure what to do with that because the shelter had strict rules that said dogs couldn't sit on furniture or roam freely. There was no softness or comfort. Hunter hesitated, then carefully lowered himself to the floor near the couch, which seemed safer. It had been a long time since anyone had touched him in that way, not out of duty or as part of a routine, but just out of kindness. Daniel sat down in a chair across the room and quietly watched as he figured it out. Emily nodded, "Yeah, he'll need some time," and Hunter closed his eyes for a moment. Would he really be allowed to be there, or was just another brief stop before he was taken away again? Hunter's first few days in his new home were quiet, though, because he wasn't incarcerated for the first time in years. He learned the house's senses, sounds, and patterns by moving cautiously around it, never going too far from the walls and never going too far into the unfamiliar space. Daniel and Emily gave him space, They didn't cram him in or try to show him affection. They spoke quietly and moved at a slow, steady pace as if they understood that trust couldn't be established overnight. Hunter ate his food, but only when no one was around. He drank from his water bowl while he watched, but he would freeze if someone walked by. He took solace in little nooks where he could watch without being seen. It wasn't that he didn't want to trust them, rather, he didn't understand how the shelter trust had resulted in injured dogs being returned frequently and families taking them home only to bring them back when they decided it was too much work. He had witnessed repeatedly and had come to realize that hope only leads to disappointment, but one evening, things changed. It was late, the house was dimly lit, and there was a gentle hum of. Hunter was lying in his usual spot near the couch, not too close nor too far, just close enough to watch, when, without really thinking, he moved it. It was just a tiny shift forward, his paws sliding slightly closer to Emily's feet. She noticed that she didn't say anything, didn't reach out, but that her lips curled into a small, knowing smile. The television filled the quiet as Emily sat on the couch with a blanket draped over her legs and her fingers moving absently along the fabric. Daniel was reading something while his brow furrowed in concentration. He inched forward once more, this time letting his head rest gently against the couch side. Emily let out a soft exhale, but she didn't touch him or hurry him. Instead, she waited until Hunter finally closed his eyes and took a deep breath. This was the first time in years that he had allowed himself to be close to someone, the first time he had allowed himself to relax, and for the first time he began to believe that perhaps this was real. As the weeks went by, Hunter gradually changed. Initially, the changes were so slight that Daniel and Emily nearly missed them. Instead of waiting for them to leave, he began eating while they were in the room. His tail, which had always been tucked low, started to lift a little when he walked. Then, one morning, Daniel clipped Hunter's leash onto his collar and took him outside. It was a warm day, the sky was a soft blue with a few white clouds scattered across it, the air smelled of freshly cut grass, and Emily stood by the porch to watch as Daniel walked Hunter down the street toward the park. Hunter moved cautiously, still unsure, still hesitant. When they arrived at the park, Daniel guided him to a grassy field away from the small playground where kids played. It was quiet, open, and a place where Hunter could breathe. Daniel kneeled next to him and unclipped the leash for a moment. Hunter just stood there, staring at Daniel. The last time he had been completely free, he had been abandoned, and the last time he had been running after someone, and Daniel didn't hurry him. Instead, he just sat back on the grass and waited. A memory flashed through Hunter's mind as he ran through a backyard, feeling the wind in his fur, hearing laughter as he chased a ball, and his paws twitched. Before he even realized what he was doing, he ran, stretching his legs and muscles, remembering what it was like to move freely. Emily gasped from the porch, covering her mouth, watching Daniel simply smile. Hunter ran in circles, initially unsure, then faster and stronger, turning back toward Daniel with his tail wagging. Hunter's tongue was hanging out for the first time since he left the shelter, and when Daniel called his name, he ran toward him without hesitation. He slid to a stop in front of him, panting heavily but alive. Daniel reached out and scratched behind his ears, saying, "Good boy." Hunter closed his eyes for the first time in years, believing that the seasons had changed, the days had grown colder, the air was crisp with the scent of autumn leaves, and the house, which had been unfamiliar, had transformed into something new. It was now Hunter. He didn't hesitate when he walked through the front door anymore, and he didn't flinch when Daniel or Emily reached out to pet him. His tail, which had been stiff and unsure, was now able to wag freely. He had learned the house's routines, that when the doorbell rang, he didn't have to be afraid, that when Emily knelt down and opened her arms, he could lean into her warmth without fear of rejection, and most importantly, he had discovered what it meant to belong once more. Hunter sighed deeply, his body completely relaxed, the old fears gone, the cold hard floors of the shelter were just a distant memory, and he was no longer the forgotten dog. One evening, as the first chill of winter set in, Hunter lay by the couch with his head resting near Daniel's feet. The fire crackled softly in the fireplace, filling the room with a golden glow. Emily curled up with a blanket and looked down at Hunter with a soft smile. "Can you believe how much he's changed?" she whispered. Daniel nodded, his fingers were idly scratching behind Hunter's ear. "There are thousands of dogs like him waiting behind metal bars, hoping that someone will look past their age and scars and see the love they still have to give. If this story touched your heart, consider supporting your local animal shelter by adopting, fostering, donating, or just being kind. He was home behind metal bars, and as he fell asleep, his final thoughts were not ones of loss or loneliness, but rather of warmth, safety, and love because, for the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for a home. Disseminate awareness, and if you enjoy this journey, please remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell someone who believes in second chances about Hunter's story. Sometimes, one person may make a lasting difference in someone's life.